Major Sarah Mitchell stood in the hangar at Nellis Air Force Base outside Las Vegas, Nevada, and watched the morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete floor. It was a cold November morning in 2019, and she had been fighting battles her entire career, not just the ones overseas, but the ones right here at home, the ones nobody talked about. She was 39 years old, with sharp features, dark eyes that had seen too much, and a body built lean and strong from years of discipline. Her brown hair was pulled back tight in regulation style. She wore her flight suit like armor, and she needed that armor because today was going to be difficult. Today was always difficult. Captain Jackson was waiting for her by the row of A-10 Thunderbolts. The distinctive aircraft sat like metal birds of prey, their twin engines and low-slung frames designed for close air support, the kind of flying that required courage, skill, and nerves of steel. The A-10 was a weapon, built to protect ground troops and deliver firepower when soldiers on the ground needed it most. "Morning, sir," Jackson said. He didn't quite meet her eyes. Sarah noticed things like that. She'd learned to notice them over 20 years in the military, the small disrespects, the way people didn't look at her, the way her voice on the radio was sometimes questioned in ways a man's voice never would have been. "Morning, Jackson. How are the birds looking today?" "Good, ma'am, ready to fly," he paused. "Though honestly, I'm surprised they're sending you up on this one. It's pretty intense, low altitude, heavy fire expected. You sure you want to?" "That's not your concern, Captain," Sarah said quietly. She'd learned that responding with anger only confirmed what they all thought about her anyway. Women in combat were supposedly emotional. Sarah had learned to be the opposite. She was ice. She was calculation. She was perfect. But inside, she felt that familiar burn, that sting of doubt they always cast on her, even when, or especially when, she was the most qualified pilot on the base. Sarah had graduated from the Air Force Academy 20 years ago, back when female pilots in fighter and attack aircraft were still rare enough to make news. She'd trained harder than everyone else. She'd scored higher. She'd flown more missions, had more combat hours, had saved more lives. She'd done everything right, played by every rule, and somewhere along the way, she'd become invisible. Not invisible in a good way. Invisible in the way that meant her achievements belonged to someone else or were written off as luck. Invisible in the way that meant when something went wrong, people whispered about women in combat. Invisible in the way that meant she was always being tested, always being watched, always being judged for things that wouldn't even be noticed if she were a man. The mission briefing was at 1000 hours. Sarah sat in the back of the briefing room, a small meeting space with metal folding chairs and a screen that showed a topographic map of a region in eastern Afghanistan. The area was labeled as hostile territory. Her mission was direct air support for a ground convoy that was moving through a mountain pass. Major Dean Hartley ran the briefing. He was 52, had been flying A-10 since 1990, and had never once looked at Sarah the way other pilots looked at each other, with that mixture of professional respect and camaraderie that came from shared risks and shared success. With Dean, Sarah got professional courtesy, nothing more. "Convoy is moving at 0600 Zulu," he said, his finger tracking across the map. "They'll be vulnerable in the canyon for approximately 45 minutes. We're expecting insurgent activity, probably from the high points on either side. Your job is to keep those guys alive. You'll be in position overhead, ready to light up any targets." Sarah knew this script. She'd flown dozens of these missions. She could do this in her sleep. "You've got limited fuel," Hartley continued, still not looking at her. "You're primary for the first window, then Captain Rodriguez takes over. If things get heavy, try not to burn through your ordnance too fast." Sarah almost smiled at that. He was giving her the beginning of the mission, knowing full well that if things got heavy, she'd need her weapons ready and fast. It was like saying, "Do this job, but don't do it too well." "Understood," she said. The other pilots filed out, chatting with each other. Nobody spoke to Sarah. This had always been the case, but lately it seemed to be getting worse. She was older now. Other women had come up behind her, younger pilots with easier paths than the one she'd carved out. But that didn't mean they wanted her around. If anything, they seemed to resent her, either as a token of an older generation or as a warning of how hard it could be. Sarah gathered her flight plan and headed to the pilot's lounge. She needed to suit up, run through her mental checklist, and prepare for 5 hours of focus and tension. This was the part of the job she loved, the clarity of it. In the air, things made sense. There was right and wrong. There was target and no target. There was save the lives of the people counting on you or fail them. She pulled on her G-suit, checking every seal. She went through the ejection seat procedures. She reviewed the weapon's load, a full complement of 30mm rounds for the Gatling gun, plus Hydra missiles and Maverick air-to-ground missiles. The A-10 was built for close support. It was basically a flying tank gun with missiles attached. It was the best tool for this job. As she walked out to the flight line, she saw Captain Rodriguez watching her. He was young, maybe 32, with that easy confidence that came from never having to prove himself twice. He'd inherit the second half of this mission, and he'd do fine. Rodriguez was good, but Rodriguez had never had to be better than good just to be taken seriously. Sarah climbed into her aircraft and settled into the seat. The pre-flight checks began: engines, hydraulics, weapon systems, communications. Everything was green. Everything was ready. The radio crackled with traffic, other aircraft, ground control, the convoy starting to move through the valley below. Reaper 1-1, the radio called. That was her. You are go for launch, weapons hot, clear skis, good hunting. Reaper 1-1 is hot, Sarah responded, coming up. The engines roared to life, a sound that still gave her chills after all these years. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the power came online. She released the parking brake and taxied out to the runway. As she lined up for takeoff, Sarah looked out at the desert stretching to the horizon. She thought about the men in that convoy. She didn't know their names, would never know them. But she was about to spend the next 5 hours of her life responsible for keeping them breathing. That was enough. That was everything, actually. That was the whole point. The engines screamed, and the A-10 jumped forward down the runway. The world fell away behind her as she climbed into the sky. And for the first time that day, Sarah Mitchell felt like herself again. The flight to the operations area took 2 hours. Sarah spent the time in quiet focus, reviewing the terrain, monitoring the weather, and staying plugged into the net. The convoy was making good progress, 3 hours behind schedule, but moving. In a few minutes, they'd be entering the canyon where she'd take up her position overhead. The valley was called Hellhorse Canyon by the troops. Nobody knew why. Sarah had looked it up once. There was no particular reason. The name just stuck because of how many firefights had happened there. Lots of rocks, lots of places to hide, lots of ways to die. She descended to 10,000 feet as she approached the area. Below, the brown mountains rose up like the bones of something ancient and dead. The road wound through them like a scar. Sarah could see the convoy now, 7 vehicles, tiny from this altitude but marked clearly on her tactical display. Reaper 1-1, I have visual on the convoy, she reported. All vehicles accounted for, moving north through the canyon, no activity yet. Copy, Reaper 1-1, came the response from the forward air controller on the ground. His name was Captain Thomas Vance, and he was riding in the lead vehicle. Sarah had worked with him before. He was professional and calm. She liked working with him. We're seeing movement up on the ridge line, Vance said a moment later. High ground to the east, maybe 1 click up the canyon. Sarah's eyes immediately went to the location. The ridge line Vance was describing rose about 800 meters above the valley floor, covered in rocky outcroppings and scrub vegetation. It was an ideal position for an ambush. Of course, there were insurgents there. There were always insurgents there. I see it, Sarah said, scanning now. She adjusted her sensors, bringing the imaging system to full magnification. The ridge line jumped into sharp focus. And there, she saw them, 3 trucks parked behind the rocks, soldiers moving. She counted at least 12, maybe 15. They were setting up positions, getting ready to rain fire down into the canyon where the convoy was moving. Sarah's jaw tightened. This was going to be close. Reaper 1-1 to ground control, she said. I've got armed personnel on the ridge, 3 vehicles, approximately 15 fighters. They're setting up an ambush. Copy that, Reaper, Vance said. How long before they have clear shots? Sarah did the math in her head. The convoy was moving at about 30 kilometers per hour. They'd be in the kill zone in approximately 3 minutes. 3 minutes maximum, she said. Less if we're unlucky. You're cleared hot, Vance said. Take them down. Reaper 1-1 is hot, coming around for the gun run. Sarah banked hard to the left, pulling the A-10 around in a tight turn. The aircraft responded instantly. It wasn't a jet fighter with needle-point precision, but it had enough agility for what she needed. She lined up on the ridge line, bringing her nose around toward the target. The insurgents saw her coming. She could see them now, tiny figures scrambling, pointing, reaching for weapons. One of them was setting up what looked like an AA gun. A man-portable air defense system, probably a Stinger or something similar. Sarah didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger. The A-10's Gatling gun could fire up to 6,500 rounds per minute. It could punch through armor plating. It was one of the most devastating weapons systems in the world. When Sarah pulled the trigger, the sound wasn't just noise, it was judgment. The ridgeline erupted. Dust and rocks and fragments of the trucks fountained into the air. The insurgents scattered, some running toward the vehicles, some diving behind rocks. Sarah saw at least 3 of them go down. Then she was past them, and she was banking around for another pass. "Beautiful work, Reaper," Vance called over the radio. "Convoy is picking up speed." Sarah lined up for a second pass. The Gatling gun roared again, and more of the ridge line disappeared in fire and dust. She could see one of the trucks catching fire, flames licking up from the cabin. The insurgents were retreating now, abandoning their positions, trying to get away. But one of them wasn't retreating. One of them was standing, raising a weapon to his shoulder. Sarah saw the flash. She felt the impact at almost the same moment, a hard jolt against the left side of her aircraft. The A-10 shuddered. "Reaper 1-1, you're hit," Vance called. "I saw the SAM launch. Are you good?" Sarah immediately checked her instruments. Engine temperature was spiking on the left side. Hydraulic pressure dropping, fuel leak significant. The aircraft was still flying, but it was bleeding. "Reaper 1-1 is damaged," she reported, keeping her voice level. "Left engine compromised, fuel leak, still controllable." She didn't mention the burning sensation in her shoulder or the dark smear on her flight suit. The missile fragment had torn through the fuselage near her ejection seat. It had come so close. Another few inches and she would have been dead. "Stand by," Vance said. "We're working through this." Sarah limped the A-10 eastward, away from the canyon. The damaged engine was pulling the aircraft's nose to the left, requiring constant correction. She was losing fuel at a terrifying rate. At this burn, she had maybe 30 minutes of flight time, 30 minutes to get somewhere safe. "Reaper 1-1, we've got a landing zone marked," Vance said. "Old airfield about 30 kilometers northeast. Coordinates are coming to your nav system now." Sarah saw the numbers pop up on her screen. 30 kilometers, she could make it. Maybe, if the engines held, if the fuel held, if nothing else went wrong. She struggled with the controls, keeping the aircraft's nose up, fighting the drag from the damaged wing and the dying engine. Below, she could see the desert stretching out, brown and hostile and empty. There was nothing down there but rocks and sand and people who wanted her dead. The airfield appeared ahead, a strip of cracked asphalt surrounded by nothing. It had been abandoned for years. There were no facilities, no emergency crews, no help, just a landing surface and hope. "Reaper 1-1 to ground control," Sarah said. "I'm going to try the landing. I'm not going to make the base." "Copy that, Reaper. Good luck." She brought the nose down, lining up on the asphalt strip. The wind was pushing her around. The damaged engine was making the aircraft sluggish. But Sarah had trained for this. She'd trained for every kind of emergency, every kind of crisis. She knew how to fly broken things back to the ground. The wheels touched the asphalt. The aircraft bounced once hard, and Sarah nearly lost it. But she corrected, bringing the nose back down, and this time the landing gear held. The A-10 screamed along the runway, losing speed, the damaged engine leaving a trail of smoke and burning fuel. Sarah hit the brakes hard. The aircraft shuddered to a stop about halfway down the runway, still rolling slightly from the force of the landing. For a moment, everything was quiet except for the hiss of hydraulic fluid and the tick-tick-tick of cooling metal. Then Sarah reached up, released her harness, and pushed open the canopy. The desert air hit her hot and dry and metallic tasting. She looked down at her shoulder and saw the blood soaking through her flight suit, not as bad as it could have been, but bad enough. She'd been hit by missile fragments. The A-10 was damaged. The mission was over. But the convoy was safe. That was what mattered. Sarah climbed out of the cockpit and dropped to the asphalt below. She was alone in the middle of the desert with a damaged aircraft and no way out. But she was alive. And somewhere behind her, the convoy was moving through the canyon under clear skies. The rescue came 2 hours later, a Chinook helicopter from the nearest forward operating base coming in fast and hot across the desert. Sarah watched it approach, her shoulder throbbing where the medic had patched her up with field dressings. The wound wasn't serious, shrapnel burns mostly, painful but not life-threatening. She'd be back in the air within a week. The Chinook landed in a cloud of dust, and soldiers jumped out, weapons ready. They helped Sarah aboard, and she strapped in a cross from a young sergeant named Martinez. He looked at her, then at her blood-stained flight suit, then back at the A-10 sitting motionless on the runway behind them. "You came down hard," he said. "Came down alive," Sarah replied. "That's what counts." The flight back to Nellie's took 2 hours. Sarah spent it looking out the window at the landscape rolling beneath them. She thought about the insurgents she'd killed that morning. She tried not to think about them, but they were there in her mind anyway. They'd been trying to kill American soldiers. She'd stopped them. That was how it worked. That was how war worked. But the war she'd been fighting her whole career wasn't over there. The war that mattered, the one that never made the news, the one that bled people dry in ways missiles never could, that war was here at home. They landed at Nellie's at dusk. An ambulance was waiting. Sarah wanted to refuse it, but the sergeant insisted, and military procedure was military procedure. At the flight surgeon's office, a doctor named Captain Reeves looked at her shoulder, cleaned the wound properly, and gave her a tetanus shot. "You're lucky," he said. "An inch to the left and you wouldn't be walking." "I know," Sarah said. "You should take some time off, rest, let this heal properly." "I'll be back on the schedule tomorrow," Sarah said. Reeves didn't argue. He'd clearly worked with pilots long enough to know that argument was pointless. Instead, he wrote out some prescriptions for pain medication and antibiotics and sent her on her way. It was dark by the time Sarah made it back to the pilot's ready room. She expected to find the usual group of pilots hanging around, debriefing, laughing, telling stories. Instead, she found silence, actual silence. They stopped talking when she walked in. Major Hartley was there. He looked up from his chair, studied her for a moment, and then looked back down at his coffee without saying anything. "The A-10?" someone asked quietly. "Damaged," Sarah said. "Missile hit left engine, aircraft is down for repairs." More silence. Then from the back corner someone laughed. It wasn't a nice laugh. It was the kind of laugh that said, "I told you so." Sarah's hands clenched into fists, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd learned that trick a long time ago, how to be angry without showing it, how to be hurt without letting it matter. She went to her locker and started changing out of her flight suit. "Heard you lost the aircraft," Captain Jackson said. He was standing nearby, not looking at her directly. "I landed it safely," Sarah said. "Pilot and aircraft both came down in one piece. Mission was successful. The convoy made it through without casualties." "Yeah, but an A-10 is $1 million aircraft," Jackson said. "That's a pretty expensive mistake." Sarah closed her locker very carefully. She turned to face Jackson with the same expression she used during combat, blank, cold, professional. "The A-10 will be repaired and back in service within 2 weeks," she said. "I've flown 17 successful missions this deployment. My combat record speaks for itself. Is there something else you'd like to discuss?" Jackson looked away first. "Nah, man, just saying that's all." Sarah finished changing and left the ready room. She didn't go back to quarters. Instead, she drove off base into Las Vegas, to a quiet bar she knew in one of the older casinos downtown. She ordered a beer and sat alone, watching the lights blur and change on the slot machine screens. She thought about the ambush. She thought about the missiles. She thought about how she'd made the right call in every moment, and it still hadn't been enough to stop people from questioning her, from doubting her, from finding a way to make it her fault somehow. Her phone buzzed. She checked it and saw a message from Captain Vance, the forward air controller, the one who'd been in the convoy. "Great work today. My guys are alive because of you. Thank you, Thomas." Sarah stared at the message for a long time. Then she put the phone away. 2 days later, the story started. It began subtly. A rumor spread by someone in the ready room. The story was simple. Sarah had been reckless. She'd pushed too hard, stayed too long, and gotten herself shot down. If she'd been more careful, more cautious, the A-10 would have been saved. The implication was clear. Women in combat made emotional decisions. They took unnecessary risks. They couldn't handle the pressure. Sarah heard the story the same way everyone else did. Someone mentioned it to her in passing, like it was common knowledge, like it was fact. "That's not what happened," Sarah said quietly. "That's what people are saying," they replied. By the end of the week, the story had evolved. Now it was, Sarah had been hit because she wasn't experienced enough. She'd made a tactical error. She'd put her wingman in danger. Never mind that she didn't have a wingman on that particular mission. Never mind that she'd taken the shot that had saved the convoy. The story had its own momentum now, and the facts didn't matter anymore. Sarah went through the motions. She attended briefings. She reviewed missions. She did her job with the same precision and excellence that had defined her entire career. But she could feel the change in how people looked at her. The doubt, the distance, the way her voice on the radio seemed to get questioned more, second-guessed more. A week after the incident, Major Hartley called her into his office. "How's the shoulder?" he asked, not looking up from his desk. "Fine, sir, ready to fly." "That's good, that's good." He turned his chair slightly, and Sarah realized he was uncomfortable. Hartley was never uncomfortable. "Look, I'm going to be honest with you, Sarah. There's been some discussion about this landing incident. Some people are concerned about risk assessment and decision-making." "I made the right call, sir," Sarah said. "The convoy made it through safely, 0 casualties." "I know that," Hartley said. "I know what happened, but perception matters in this command. And right now, the perception is that something went wrong because of poor judgment." "That's not fair," Sarah said. And there it was, the word she'd trained herself never to say. Somehow it came out anyway. Hartley leaned back in his chair. "Nothing's fair, Mitchell. You know that as well as I do. You've been in this Air Force for 20 years. I've watched your career. You're a great pilot. But sometimes a great pilot isn't enough." "What are you saying, sir?" "I'm saying that I'm recommending you for a rest rotation. 3 months off combat flying. Full medical clearance, obviously, but we want to make sure you're good to go before you get back in the air." Sarah felt something inside her go very still. 3 months off combat flying. That was career damage. That was doubt. That was the kind of thing that didn't disappear from your record, no matter what the official reason was. "With all respect, sir, I'm fit to fly," Sarah said. "I'm sure you are," Hartley said. "But this is not negotiable. It's for your own good." Sarah left his office and sat in her car for an hour, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard that her knuckles turned white. She'd been benched. She'd been pulled from combat flying not because she wasn't capable, but because of the story. Because of what people were saying. Because her gender had become a liability, and the easiest solution was to make her disappear for a while. That night, alone in her quarters, Sarah Mitchell did something she hadn't done in years. She cried. The next 3 months were the longest of Sarah's career. She was officially on medical leave, which meant she was allowed on base but nowhere near the flight line. She was offered desk jobs, training positions, administrative work. She turned them all down. Instead, she spent her time at her apartment in Las Vegas, staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about the fact that her aircraft were flying without her, and that other pilots were getting the missions that should have been hers. The isolation was worse than any physical wound. At least physical wounds healed. This was different. This was the slow erosion of everything she'd built, one decision at a time. She got calls from the few pilots who'd stayed in touch, people like Captain Rodriguez, who'd taken over the second half of her mission that day. Rodriguez always sounded uncomfortable on the phone, like he was betraying her by continuing to do the job they both loved. "You'll be back," he said once. "This is just politics." "Yeah," Sarah said, "maybe." But she wasn't sure she wanted to be back. Not if it meant fighting the same battles forever. Not if every decision she made would be scrutinized twice as hard, questioned twice as long, and blamed twice as much when things went wrong. Then came the letter. It arrived at her apartment in early February, official Air Force letterhead, from the Inspector General's office. Sarah opened it and read the first line, and her breath caught. "An investigation has been opened regarding potential misconduct in the incident of December 15, 2019, involving Major Sarah Mitchell and aircraft loss at Remote Landing Field, Tango 7. Sarah read the letter 3 times, making sure she understood. Someone had filed a complaint. Someone was saying that she'd deliberately damaged the A-10, that she'd made reckless decisions, that she was unfit to fly. They wanted to interview her. They wanted to review all her missions from the past year. Sarah called the number listed on the letter and spoke to a Major David Chen, the officer in charge of the investigation. "I can answer your questions right now," she said. "What happened on December 15th was a combat situation. I was hit by enemy fire. I landed the aircraft safely. The mission was successful." "That may be true," Chen said. "But we've received information suggesting that there were procedural violations and potentially intentional disregard for safety protocols. We'd like to go through everything systematically." When, Sarah asked. "Can you come in tomorrow morning, 0800? Sarah was there at 7:45 in her dress uniform with every piece of documentation she could find. Flight logs, mission records, communications transcripts, maintenance reports, everything. Chen was a thin man in his 50s with gray hair and the flat expression of someone who'd spent his career making judgment calls that nobody wanted made. For 6 hours, they went through every detail of the mission, where she'd positioned the aircraft, why she'd made certain decisions, what her reasoning had been at every step. Chen asked the same questions repeatedly, looking for inconsistencies, looking for something, anything, that would support the complaint. Finally, at the end, Sarah asked, "Who filed this complaint?" "I can't tell you that," Chen said, "but I can tell you that it came from within your chain of command." Sarah's stomach dropped. Within her chain of command. That meant it was someone who knew her, someone who'd worked with her, someone she'd trusted. The investigation dragged on for weeks. Chen interviewed pilots, maintenance crews, ground controllers, commanders. He reviewed every radio transcript, every flight record. Sarah waited, suspended in this horrible limbo, unable to fly, unable to move forward, unable to escape the weight of someone else's accusation. She started researching the complaint on her own. She read through all the official documents, looking for any clue about who would have filed it. The complaint alleged that she'd ignored safety protocols, that she'd been warned about the dangerous condition of the aircraft, that she'd proceeded anyway. None of it was true. All of it could be twisted to sound true if you didn't know the facts. Then she found something buried in a maintenance report. A note in the aircraft log from the day before her mission. Minor hydraulic adjustment required. Aircraft maintained airworthiness. Ready for operations. That note was dated December 14, signed by Captain Jackson. Sarah reread it 3 times. Jackson, the captain who'd suggested she didn't belong on the mission, the captain who'd questioned her decision-making afterward. Jackson had signed off on the aircraft, had declared it ready for operations, and now apparently someone, possibly Jackson, was trying to claim that she'd ignored warnings about the aircraft's condition. Sarah called her lawyer, a civilian attorney she'd hired to protect her interests during the investigation. His name was Robert Torres, and he was very good at what he did. "This is serious," he said after she explained everything. "But it's also clearly retaliatory. Someone filed a complaint because they wanted to damage your career, and now they're trying to make it stick by rewriting the facts." "Can you prove that?" Sarah asked. "I can try, but it depends on what the investigation turns up. In the meantime, you need to be very careful about what you say and who you say it to." Sarah had already learned that lesson. She'd learned it years ago when she was a young pilot and an older officer had told her that women had to be perfect, had to make no mistakes, because one mistake would follow them forever. She tried to be perfect, but perfect apparently wasn't enough. In late March, 3 months after her landing, the investigation concluded. Chen called Sarah in to inform her of his findings. "Based on my review," he said, "I found no evidence of misconduct, no evidence of deliberate disregard for safety protocols, and no evidence that you violated any Air Force regulations. The incident was a combat situation in which you made appropriate decisions under tactical pressure. The aircraft was damaged by enemy action, not by pilot error. You are cleared to return to full flying status." Sarah felt something inside her relax just slightly. "The complaint itself," Chen continued, "appears to have been filed based on false or misleading information. I've referred the matter to your chain of command for appropriate follow-up." "Follow-up," Sarah said. "What does that mean?" "It means that someone made false accusations against you, and that will be addressed." But Sarah knew what would really happen. An internal meeting, maybe a letter in someone's file, nothing that would make headlines, nothing that would fix what had been broken. "When can I fly?" she asked. "You're cleared effective immediately," Chen said. "Welcome back, Major." Sarah left his office and walked across the base toward the flight line. The desert sun was bright and hot, and the smell of jet fuel hit her like a memory. She'd spent her career here in places like this. She'd been willing to die for her country. She'd been willing to do anything, be anything, to be part of something bigger than herself. But now she understood that it didn't matter how good you were. It didn't matter how much you gave. If someone decided to destroy you, they could do it, and the system would let them try. Sarah returned to the flight line on April 1st, exactly 4 months after she'd come down at the remote airfield. The A-10 had been repaired and was back in rotation. She walked through the hangar in the early morning, and the pilots who saw her nodded in acknowledgement but didn't approach her. The distance had solidified into something permanent. Major Hartley called her into his office that afternoon. "Good to have you back," he said, and he sounded like he meant it. Or at least he sounded like he was going to pretend to mean it. "Thank you, sir," Sarah said. "The investigation cleared you, obviously. Everything is fine. We're moving forward." Sarah didn't believe him. She'd learned that in the military, moving forward didn't mean forgetting. It meant compartmentalizing. It meant pretending that everything was normal when everyone knew it wasn't. It meant that she was back in the air, but she was also back in the doghouse. Back to being questioned. Back to being the problem. "I appreciate that, sir," Sarah said. "I'm ready to fly." "I'm sure you are," Hartley said. "Look, Sarah, I want to be honest with you. You're a good pilot, one of the best I've worked with, but this situation, all of this, has become complicated. The command is aware of what happened, aware of the false complaint, but there's residual damage. People are going to be careful around you now." "Because I was attacked?" Sarah asked. "Because someone tried to destroy my career and failed?" "Because of how it looks," Hartley said. "And look, I'm on your side, but I have to manage this command and I can't have drama." The word hung in the air between them. Drama. As if fighting for her career, as if defending herself against false accusations, as if being a woman in an institution that had spent decades pretending she didn't exist, as if all of that was just drama. Sarah left Hartley's office and went straight to the flight line. She wanted to see her aircraft. She needed to feel the solidity of it, the realness of it, the one part of her job that had never disappointed her. The A-10 was there in the hangar, looking like itself again. The repair work had been thorough. No one would know that it had been shot down unless they looked very closely. "Beautiful bird," someone said behind her. Sarah turned and found Captain Rodriguez. He was smiling, but it was a careful smile. "She flies true," Sarah said. "You should hear the talk around the base," Rodriguez said. "About what happened with the investigation, about the complaint." "I don't want to hear it," Sarah said. "You need to hear it," Rodriguez said quietly. "Jackson filed the complaint. Everyone knows it, everyone's talking about it. He tried to destroy your career because you didn't take his shit that day on the tarmac, because you stood up to him." Sarah felt that burn again, that quiet rage that she kept locked down so carefully. "Can you prove that?" she asked. "I don't have to," Rodriguez said. "The investigation proves it. They knew it was him, but what they did about it is nothing, a conversation, a note in his file that nobody will ever see." "What am I supposed to do?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," Rodriguez said. "But I know that Jackson's flying the training squadron rotation starting next month. And I know that he's going to be back stateside, not in the combat rotation. And I know that you're going to be left here, wondering why a guy who tried to destroy you got transferred out like nothing happened." After Rodriguez left, Sarah sat in the pilot's lounge and thought. She'd spent 20 years doing everything right, following the rules, playing by the system. And the system had failed her. The system had let someone attack her, had investigated the attack, had proven it was an attack, and then had basically done nothing about it. The rage, the real rage, finally broke through the ice she'd been living behind for so long. She went home and sat at her computer. She had documentation. She had the investigation report. She had the maintenance logs, the flight records, the communications transcripts. She had everything. And she started putting it together, not for the military, for the press. There was a reporter at the Phoenix Gazette named Catherine Martinez. She was a veteran herself, had flown transport helicopters, and she'd written extensively about the challenges women faced in the military. Sarah found her email and sent her a message. "I have a story about what happens when women stand up for themselves in the military, and what happens when the system tries to destroy them for it. Do you want to hear it?" Catherine responded within an hour. They met at a coffee shop in Las Vegas the next day. Sarah brought everything, all the documents, all the evidence, all the proof of what had happened. Catherine read through it all carefully, taking notes, asking questions. When she finished, she looked at Sarah with something like awe. "This is big," she said. "This is really big. You understand that once I publish this, everything changes for you, your career." "My career is already over," Sarah said quietly. "I just don't want other people to have to go through this. I want people to know what happens here." The story came out on April 15th. It made the front page of the Arizona section of the Phoenix Gazette, and then it started spreading. A woman fighter pilot falsely accused by a superior officer, vindicated by an investigation, and then left to quietly disappear while the accuser faced no real consequences. The story went viral on military forums. It got picked up by national outlets. CNN called and wanted to interview Sarah. So did NBC News. Sarah agreed to one interview. She sat in a studio in Las Vegas and told her story, not with anger, but with the same calm professionalism she brought to everything else. She talked about what had happened that day in the canyon. She talked about the missile hit. She talked about saving the convoy. She talked about how she'd been questioned not for her actions, but for her judgment based on false accusations from someone who'd been threatened by the fact that she was competent and wouldn't be intimidated. The interview aired on a Sunday evening. By Monday morning, the Air Force had announced an investigation into possible retaliation against personnel who file complaints or are the subject of investigations. By Tuesday, Captain Jackson had been suspended from flying duties, pending the outcome of the investigation. By Wednesday, there were stories in every major news outlet in America. The headline on the New York Times read, "Female A-10 pilot forced out after false accusations, investigation shows." And on Thursday, Major Hartley called Sarah into his office with 2 stars, colonels, sitting in the room with him. The colonels looked uncomfortable. "Major Mitchell," one of them said, "we want to apologize for how this situation was handled. The Air Force failed you. We're going to do better." Sarah didn't say anything. They said more words, empty words about policy changes and better oversight and their commitment to treating all personnel fairly. She listened to all of it without responding. She'd heard these apologies before, or versions of them anyway. She didn't believe them, but she also didn't argue. 6 months later, in October, Sarah stood once again at the entrance to the flight line at Nellis Air Force Base. The desert was cooling down as fall approached. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, and in front of her, her A-10 waited, ready to fly. A lot had changed in those 6 months. Captain Jackson had been court-martialed for filing a false report and attempting to damage an officer's career. He'd been dishonorably discharged. The Air Force had announced new policies about treatment of female pilots, about investigation procedures, about how complaints were handled. Major Hartley had been replaced as commander. The new commander was a woman, Colonel Susan Richardson, who'd flown F-16s and had no patience for the old ways of doing things. Sarah's story had become something bigger than she'd expected. She'd received hundreds of letters from women in the military, women who'd experienced similar things, women who were afraid to speak up because they feared retaliation. The story had forced conversations that the military had been avoiding for decades. Not everything had changed, it was too late for that, but something had shifted. The system was at least paying attention now, at least acknowledging that there was a problem. The press had called her a hero. That bothered her more than the original accusations had. She wasn't a hero. She was just a pilot who'd done her job and then told the truth about what happened. But she understood that sometimes the truth was heroic simply because so many people wanted to keep it hidden. She still had friends in the military, pilots she'd flown with for years who'd stuck by her through the worst of it. Rodriguez was one. So was Vance, the forward air controller from that day in the canyon. They'd become closer after everything happened. Vance was still flying missions out of forward operating base Lamont, and he'd requested Sarah specifically to be part of his support rotation. "You ready?" Rodriguez asked. He was standing next to the A-10 now, grinning. He'd been assigned to be her flight lead for the training mission scheduled for that day. "Always," Sarah said. They did the pre-flight checks together, moving through the routine that had been drilled into them both for years. Everything was green. Everything was ready. The engines roared to life, and Sarah felt that familiar electric pulse running through her body, the reminder that she was doing what she loved, what she was born to do. The flight itself was routine. Combat training sorties usually were, unless something went wrong. But this one was special because it was her first training mission since returning to full active duty. It was her statement that she was back, that she was staying, and that nothing was going to push her out. As they climbed to altitude, Sarah thought about the past year. The ambush in the canyon, the missile hit, the landing in the desert, the investigation, the complaint, the counterattack through the media, the victory that hadn't felt like a victory because the cost had been so high. She thought about all the women who'd come before her, who'd fought these battles without anyone paying attention. She thought about all the women who would come after, who would still have to fight because one victory didn't change a system that had been broken for decades. She thought about her mother, who'd raised her to believe that she could do anything, be anything, if she tried hard enough. Sarah had tried hard enough, but trying hard enough only mattered if the system was willing to let you win. "You're quiet today," Rodriguez said over the radio. "Just thinking," Sarah replied. "About what?" "About tomorrow." The next day was significant. Sarah had been invited to speak to the new class of pilots entering flight school. She was going to talk about excellence, about perseverance, about standing up for what was right. She was going to talk about her career, the good parts and the hard parts, and she was going to tell a room full of young pilots, men and women both, that the only way the system changed was if people were willing to fight for change, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. But before that speech, she had something else to do. That evening, Sarah drove out to the cemetery on the edge of Las Vegas where her father was buried. She hadn't been there since he died 4 years ago. He'd been an Air Force mechanic, had worked on B-17s during Vietnam, had come home broken in ways that no one talked about back then. He'd loved the Air Force and hated what it did to people. But he'd loved Sarah unconditionally, and he'd always told her that if she was going to do something, she should do it better than anyone else. She stood in front of his grave and thought about what she would tell him if he were still alive. She thought about telling him that it had been worth it, that standing up for herself had cost her more than she'd expected, but it had also shown her that she was capable of more than she'd known. That pain and strength weren't separate things. They were the same thing, looked at from different angles. "I did okay, Dad," she said quietly. "Not perfect, but okay." The wind moved across the cemetery, warm and desert dry, and carrying the smell of dust and sagebrush. Sarah thought about airfields in Afghanistan, about the moments when the aircraft systems came alive under her hands, about the weight of responsibility that came with being responsible for other people's lives. She thought about how that was also the honor of it, the reason she'd stayed this long, fought this hard, sacrificed this much. The next morning, Sarah stood in a classroom full of new pilots and told them her story. She told them about the canyon, about the missile, about coming down in the desert. She told them about the investigation and the false complaint. She told them about fighting back, about refusing to be invisible. And she told them something that she'd learned through the whole experience. The military will test you, not just with combat and physical challenges, but with systems that are designed to break people. Your job is to not break. Your job is to do your work with excellence and integrity, and to know that if you do, nothing anybody else does or says can take that away from you, because you'll know the truth, and truth is stronger than anything else. When she finished, the young pilots, men and women, all of them looking like they'd just come out of their first combat engagement with their own eyes, applauded. And Sarah felt something settle inside her. Not closure exactly. The weight of everything that had happened wouldn't go away, but the weight had become purposeful. It had meaning now. That afternoon, Sarah returned to the flight line. There was another mission scheduled for the next day, reconnaissance and support work for a convoy moving through a different sector. Sarah studied the maps, reviewed the briefing, and prepared her mind the way pilots learn to do, completely present, focused, ready. But as she was leaving the briefing room, Colonel Richardson pulled her aside. "I wanted to tell you something privately," she said. "Before the official announcement, you're being promoted to lieutenant colonel. You'll be taking over the training squadron starting in January. Full command." Sarah felt something shift inside her. It wasn't the promotion that mattered, though it was important. It was what it meant. It meant that the Air Force was finally actually changing. It meant that someone like her, someone who'd fought the system and won, could move forward instead of being pushed aside. "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah said. "No," Colonel Richardson said. "Thank you for not letting them break you, for telling the truth, for making this place a little better for everyone who comes after you." That night, Sarah drove out into the desert outside Las Vegas and sat on a hilltop, watching the sun go down. The sky turned red and orange and finally dark blue, and the stars started appearing one by one. The city lights glowed on the horizon, small and human and temporary against the vastness of the universe. Sarah thought about legacy. She thought about the fact that she wouldn't change the whole system by herself. The military would still be broken in many ways when she retired. Women would still face challenges that men didn't face. But maybe, just maybe, the next woman who stood up to be treated fairly would find it a little bit easier because Sarah had done it first. 2 days later, Sarah climbed into her A-10 for the reconnaissance mission. The aircraft hummed to life around her. the engines roaring with that familiar sound that still gave her chills after 20 years. She checked her instruments, confirmed her weapons systems, and spoke quietly into her radio. "Reaper 1-1 is up, coming hot, ready to support." The response came back. "Copy that, Reaper 1-1, we've been waiting for you, good to have you back." And as Sarah pulled back on the stick and felt the aircraft climb into the clear blue sky, she understood something fundamental. This was why she'd fought so hard. Not for herself, though it had been worth it for herself, but for this moment. For the fact that she'd never have to wonder if she was good enough. She'd proven she was, and nothing anyone said or did could ever change that. The A-10 climbed higher, leaving the Earth behind, heading toward the horizon where the next mission waited. And Major Sarah Mitchell, soon to be Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, flew toward whatever came next with the same grace and strength she'd brought to everything else. The thunder of her engines echoed across the desert, a sound that meant protection, that meant justice, that meant a woman who had refused to disappear was still here, still fighting, still strong. And that sound, more than any official recognition or promotion or news story, was the truest measure of victory.